The phone rang at exactly 3:03 a.m., shattering the fragile silence of my Paris apartment. I jolted awake, heart hammering, fumbling in the darkness. On the screen, Chloe's name flashed like a warning. My sister never called, especially not at this hour. I answered on the third ring, my voice thick with sleep. Chloe? A raw, broken sob exploded through the line, snapping me fully awake. Sophie, it's Dad, she gasped between tears. He had a heart attack. They don't think he's going to make it. My mind blanked. For a moment, I simply sat there, frozen, unable to comprehend the words spilling from her. What? When? Where is he? I choked out, flinging off the covers. Hartford Medical. Mom's there with him. Nathan too, but he was asking for you before they took him into surgery. Chloe's voice cracked completely, dissolving into wretched crying. You need to come home. Please, Sophie, come home. I was already moving, the cold wooden floor stinging my bare feet as I stumbled toward the closet. I'm coming, I promised, grabbing the first clothes I could find and throwing them into a half-empty suitcase. The zipper stuck, my hands trembling, so badly I had to yank it free with a curse. 10 minutes later, I was racing down the narrow streets toward Charles de Gaulle Airport, the early morning fog blurring the world into indistinct shapes. Flights to the U.S. were limited at this hour, but I didn't care. I would pay anything, do anything to get back. By some miracle, I secured the last seat on a flight to New York, a business-class ticket that devoured the remains of my savings without a second thought. As I handed over my passport and boarding pass, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Mrs. Langston, our old neighbor in Vermont. Just 2 words. Be careful. I frowned, heart twisting tighter, but there was no time to dwell on it. Not now. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare of stale airport air, overpriced coffee, and the constant throb of dread in my chest. Every time the gate agents called a boarding announcement, I half expected them to summon me over the loudspeaker and deliver the final blow. Somewhere over the Atlantic, staring at the tiny screen on the seat in front of me, I allowed myself a single thought. What if I was too late? Images flooded my mind. The last Christmas I'd spent in Asbury, Dad laughing as he carved the turkey, his warm hand squeezing my shoulder, telling me how proud he was that I'd chased my dreams in Paris. Even now, the sound of his voice could break me. I clutched the small locket around my neck, a gift from him on my 21st birthday, feeling its cool weight against my skin. I'm coming. Dad, I whispered under my breath. Just hold on. When we finally touched down at JFK, the cold March air sliced through my thin coat as I raced for my connection. Vermont felt a world away, and yet somehow, as the plane lifted into the pale winter sky, dread pooled deeper in my stomach. The closer I got to home, the heavier the feeling grew. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but it was too late to turn back. By the time we descended over the snowy fields of Vermont, my heart was a raw, ragged thing barely holding together. Nathan would be waiting at the airport, Chloe had said. He would drive me straight to the hospital. I clung to that plan like a lifeline, forcing myself to believe in it, because the alternative, the idea that something even worse was waiting for me, was simply too much to bear. As the wheels touched the runway, I exhaled shakily, gripping the armrest until my knuckles whitened. Just get to Dad, I muttered under my breath. Just get to Dad. I had no idea that by the end of that day, the man I thought I knew, the family I had trusted, and everything I believed about love and loyalty would be shattered beyond repair. Nathan was already waiting at the gate, standing stiffly near the baggage carousel with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. He looked just as I remembered, tall, athletic, with that effortless New England preppiness my mother had always praised. But there was something different, too. His face was tight, pale, and when he spotted me, the smile he forced onto his lips didn't reach his eyes. Sophie, he said, pulling me into a hug that was all hard arms and no warmth. I stiffened instinctively, catching the sharp scent of his aftershave and something else underneath. Nerves. I'm so glad you made it. How's Dad? I demanded, pulling back to study his face. His gaze flickered, just for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. It's touch and go, Nathan said, grabbing my suitcase and steering me toward the exit almost too quickly. They're doing everything they can. Mom's with him. Chloe too. Everyone's just been devastated. His voice cracked slightly, but it sounded wrong, rehearsed. I want to go straight to the hospital, I said, quickening my pace. Nathan hesitated. Actually, Mom was hoping you could stop by the house first. Freshen up. Change. You've had a long flight. The whole family's gathering there. It'll mean a lot to everyone to see you. I stopped in my tracks, blinking at him. Nathan, is he stable? I mean, why would we go straight to see him if it's that serious? He shifted, avoiding my eyes, before pasting that brittle smile back on. Of course we'll go. Just, you know how Mom gets. She wants you to look your best. For Dad. The explanation made my stomach twist uncomfortably. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense, but arguing in the middle of the terminal wouldn't change anything. Reluctantly, I followed him to the parking lot, the Vermont air sharp and biting against my skin. Nathan's SUV gleamed under the weak winter sun, newer than the last one I remembered. As he loaded my suitcase into the back, I glanced around, feeling strangely disconnected from everything. It had been 5 years since I last set foot in Asbury, and already the place felt off. The drive home took longer than it should have. Nathan took the scenic route, winding through back roads lined with skeletal trees and frozen fields. I stared out the window, catching glimpses of change, new developments, glossy storefronts, subdivisions that hadn't existed before. Notably, many of them bore a familiar logo, Aldridge Property Group. You guys have been busy, I remarked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Nathan chuckled dryly. Dad's vision, expanding the family legacy. You know how he is. Must have taken a lot of investment, I said casually, watching his knuckles whiten against the steering wheel. Yeah, well, we had some supportive backers. People who believe in us. His voice was clipped defensive. I said nothing, but the unease that had been coiling in my gut since Paris tightened further. Something was wrong. Not just wrong, rotten. When we finally pulled into the long gravel driveway of the Aldridge family estate, my heart sank further. The house itself hadn't changed, still the grand colonial-style mansion with white columns and dark shutters, but the driveway was packed with cars. Expensive ones. Too expensive. One vehicle caught my eye immediately. A sleek silver Mercedes that I knew belonged to Philip Hartman, the Aldridge family's longtime attorney. My breath hitched. Why was Philip here? And why now? Nathan, I said slowly, what's going on? Why is Philip at the house? Just family stuff, he muttered, slamming the car door harder than necessary. Let's go inside first. Then we'll head to the hospital. No, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I want to see Dad. Now. Nathan froze for a beat, then forced another strained smile. Of course. We'll just check in with Mom first. She's been waiting for you. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to run, I followed him up the steps. The heavy front door swung open before he even reached for the knob, and there was my mother, Meredith Aldridge, looking as polished as ever in a cashmere sweater and pearls, her makeup impeccable, her smile brittle around the edges. Sophie, darling, she said, reaching for me with outstretched arms. You're finally home. Home. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I didn't return my mother's embrace. I stood stiff, cold, my arms at my sides. Her perfume, something floral and heavy, clung to the air between us, suffocating. She withdrew after a beat, her smile faltering just a fraction before snapping back into place. We're all so relieved you made it, she said, smoothing the front of her sweater. It's been difficult. I want to see Dad, I said immediately, my voice sharper than I intended. Now, Meredith and Nathan exchanged a glance. It was quick, practiced, but I caught it, the silent conversation passing between them like a spark. "Of course," Nathan said hurriedly. "Of course. Let's get your things inside first, and—" "No," I interrupted, stepping back. "Take me to the hospital. Right now." A tense silence stretched between us. I watched their carefully composed faces slip, the masks they wore every day for the benefit of Asbury society starting to crack. Nathan cleared his throat. "The car's still running," he said, shooting Mom a look that I wasn't supposed to notice. "We'll head over." He grabbed the keys again, and we returned to the SUV without another word. As we pulled out of the driveway, I caught one last glimpse of the scene inside the house. A cluster of relatives, huddled around laptops and stacks of papers, their faces lit by the cold glow of spreadsheets and contracts. Not a prayer circle, not a vigil. Business. My hands clenched into fists in my lap. The drive to Hartford General was suffocating. Nathan gripped the steering wheel like it might fly away if he let go. I stared straight ahead, the silence between us thick and unnatural. When we finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, Nathan moved with the air of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Too exactly. He led me through the main doors, past the check-in desk, straight toward the elevators without so much as glancing at the signage. I followed, dread curdling in my stomach. On the cardiac care floor, Nathan approached the nurse's station with a confidence that rang false. "Hi," he said. "We're here for Richard Aldridge. Room 417. The charge nurse, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, frowned slightly, typing into her computer. She shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "We don't have a patient by that name." Nathan stiffened. There must be a mistake. He was admitted yesterday. Heart attack. The nurse's frown deepened. "I've been here since yesterday morning. We haven't admitted anyone named Aldridge. And room 417 has been empty since Tuesday." The world tilted. For a moment, I thought I might actually black out. I turned slowly toward Nathan, whose face had gone sheet white. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice shaking with fury. "Nathan, tell me right now." He opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed hard. Maybe they moved him to another hospital. "Liar," I said, so loudly the heads in the waiting area turned. "You're lying to me." I stepped back, putting space between us. The walls of the hospital seemed to close in around me, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder, the floor swaying under my feet. "Let's just go back to the house," Nathan said quickly, his voice low and urgent. "We'll explain everything there." I didn't move. I stared at him. This man I had once looked up to, who used to teach me how to ride a bike and fix a flat tire, now reduced to a stammering stranger. "You faked it," I said numbly. "You faked Dad's heart attack to bring me back." Nathan reached for me, but I jerked away. "Don't touch me," I hissed. "I swear, if you try to lie to me again, I'll scream this entire hospital down." For a second, I thought he might drag me out by force. Then his shoulders sagged, defeat leaking out of him like air from a punctured balloon. "Dad's fine," he muttered. "He's at home. It was just a scare, a minor one." I laughed, a harsh, broken sound that echoed down the sterile hallway. "You lied," I said again, because I couldn't seem to stop myself. "You made me think he was dying." "I'm sorry," Nathan said, but the words were hollow, meaningless. "We needed you home, sophomore. It's important. Family is important. Family." I pushed past him, my chest heaving, my vision blurring. I didn't know what was waiting for me back at that house, but whatever it wasn't love. It wasn't family. It was something far, far worse. The ride back to the house was a slow, suffocating crawl. Nathan didn't speak, and neither did I. The tension in the car was so thick it felt like a physical thing, pressing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe. I stared out the window, fists clenched, watching the winter landscape blur past. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation at the hospital, the lies, the betrayal, the dawning horror that the family I had clung to across continents and oceans had lured me back under false pretenses. When we pulled into the driveway again, I didn't wait for Nathan to park properly. I unbuckled, shoved the door open, and strode up the porch steps, my boots striking the wood hard enough to echo. The front door swung open before I could touch the handle. Meredith stood there, perfectly composed as ever. Behind her, the house buzzed with energy, but not the frantic, morning kind. No, this was something else entirely. The low murmur of voices, the clatter of coffee cups, the shuffle of papers being moved hastily. Business, deals, strategies. My stomach twisted tighter. Sophie, my mother said, her voice syrupy sweet, let's sit down. You must be exhausted after such a long journey. I want the truth, I snapped. Right now. The dining room looked like a war room. Philip Hartman was seated at the head of the table. A spread of documents and contracts fanned out before him, like a general preparing for battle. Chloe sat nearby, no longer tear-streaked, calmly sipping a latte from a porcelain cup. A few other relatives, cousins, uncles, names I hadn't heard in years, hovered along the edges, avoiding my gaze. And then there was Dad. Richard Aldridge stood by the window, perfectly healthy, swirling a glass of brandy in one hand, gazing out at the snow-dusted lawn as if he hadn't just been pronounced at death's door the night before. He turned when he heard my footsteps. His face split into a practiced smile. "Sweetheart," he said warmly, stepping toward me. "You're home." I flinched back before he could touch me. The smile faltered. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "Don't you dare." A heavy silence fell over the room. "Sophie, please," my mother began, smoothing the front of her sweater as she always did when uncomfortable. "We can explain everything." "Explain?" I barked a bitter laugh. "Explain how you lied about Dad dying to drag me back across the world? Explain how you used my love for him as bait?" Philip cleared his throat delicately. "Perhaps we should all sit." "I'm not sitting," I snapped. "Not until someone tells me why you faked a medical emergency." The room shifted. Eyes darted away. Feet shuffled. Finally, it was Dad who spoke, voice calm, reasonable, like he was explaining something to a child. "There's a situation, Sophie," he said, "with the company. Some financial difficulties. We need to make some strategic decisions to preserve the Aldridge legacy." I stared at him, incredulous. "And that required lying to me, making me think you were on your deathbed." We couldn't discuss it over the phone. Meredith interjected quickly. "It's too important." The pieces snapped together then, the urgent calls, the gathering of family, the lawyer already waiting, and my birthday looming just 3 weeks away. "You didn't bring me home because you missed me," I said slowly. "You brought me home because of the inheritance." No one answered. They didn't have to. "You want my trust fund," I said, feeling the final betrayal slot into place like a dagger between my ribs. "Grandpa Frederick's money. The trust that matures when I turn 30. Dad spread his hands, as if that made it reasonable. "It's not about the money, Sophie. It's about the future. The company is the family's future. Your future." "My future," I repeated flatly. "You mean your lifeboat." Chloe set down her coffee cup with a soft clink. "We're family, Sophie," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "We stick together." Family. That word again. Twisted and warped beyond recognition. I looked around at the faces that had once been my world. The smiling liars, the cold manipulators, the people who thought they could summon me back like a trained dog when it suited them. I thought of Paris, of the tiny apartment I had fought so hard to afford, of the designs that bore my name, of the life I had built with my own hands. They didn't want me. They wanted what I could give them, and they were about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. Dinner that night was a grotesque parody of normalcy. Meredith had made pot roast, my favorite when I was a child, and the smell filled the house with a warmth that felt counterfeit now. The dining table was set with the good china, crystal glasses winking under the chandelier's glow. Everyone played their part, smiling, passing dishes, asking hollow questions about Paris, my career, my plans for the future, as if they hadn't just ripped away any illusion of trust between us. I barely tasted the food. Each bite turned to ash in my mouth. I answered their questions in clipped, polite phrases, keeping my anger tightly bottled under a mask of cool civility. Across the table, Dad nodded approvingly, like a general watching a soldier fall back into line. When the plates were cleared, Richard rose, swirling the last of his brandy in the glass. "Tomorrow," he announced, "Philip will walk you through some opportunities with the company. Exciting prospects. With your help, Sophie, we can ensure the Aldridge legacy for generations to come." I forced a smile, my face aching with the effort. "I look forward to it," I lied smoothly. Their relief was palpable, filling the room like smoke. They thought they had me, but the night was far from over. Feigning exhaustion and jet lag, I excused myself early, climbing the stairs to my childhood bedroom. The moment I closed the door, I dropped the facade, leaning heavily against it, heart pounding. The room was almost unnervingly unchanged, posters peeling from the walls, an old quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, like a shrine to the girl I used to be, the girl they thought had returned, obedient and naive. At 8:45 p.m., I slipped out the back door. The walk to Pete's Diner was short, but each step felt like a rebellion. The cold night air bit at my cheeks, and my breath fogged in front of me. Neon lights buzzed softly above the diner entrance, casting a sickly glow onto the cracked pavement. Inside, Mrs. Langston waited in a corner booth, a pot of tea steaming between her gnarled hands. She looked up as the door jingled, her sharp blue eyes softening when she saw me. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said as I slid into the booth. "I almost didn't," I admitted, shrugging off my coat. "But I need answers." The waitress approached, and I ordered a coffee, waiting until she was out of earshot before leaning in. "They lied to me," I said in a low voice. "About everything. Dad's fine. They faked it to get me home." Mrs. Langston nodded grimly. "I suspected as much." "Why?" I demanded. "Why would they go that far?" She took a long sip of her tea, then set the cup down with a soft clink. "Because they're drowning, Sophie, and they see you as the last rope." She reached into her oversized handbag and pulled out a folded newspaper, sliding it across the table. It was the business section from a few months back. A small headline caught my eye. "Aldridge Property Group faces investor lawsuit, Lakeside Development halted." My stomach dropped. "They expanded too fast," Mrs. Langston said quietly. "Took on too many projects. Leveraged everything they had, and some things they didn't." I thought of the gleaming new developments, the empty storefronts, the forced smiles. They needed constant new investments to stay afloat, she continued, her voice low and steady. When that dried up, they turned to other sources, shadier ones, private lenders, offshore accounts, shell companies. "And now," I said, voice hollow, "they want my inheritance to plug the holes." Bingo! The waitress returned with my coffee. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, needing the grounding sensation. "It's worse than just bad business decisions, Sophie," Mrs. Langston said after a beat. "If even half the rumors are true, they're facing more than bankruptcy. We're talking fraud, wire fraud, securities violations, maybe even money laundering." I stared down into my coffee, the black liquid trembling slightly in my hands. Everything was unraveling faster than I could process. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Langston's eyes softened. "Because your grandfather was my friend. Frederick trusted you to be the one who broke the cycle. He knew this day might come." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. "So," she said, her voice steady, "the question is, are you going to let them sink you too?" I looked out the diner window, the darkened streets of Ashaberry stretching endlessly ahead. Somewhere in that darkness, my family waited, sharpening their knives, cloaked in smiles. And for the first time since I stepped off that plane, I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I played my part perfectly. I descended the grand staircase wearing a soft sweater and jeans, casual, approachable, non-threatening. My hair was brushed into loose waves, my makeup natural. I looked every inch the prodigal daughter returned home, ready to fall back into the family fold, and they ate it up. Mom smiled warmly as she slid a plate of pancakes in front of me. Dad clapped a hand on my shoulder, squeezing just a bit too hard. Nathan poured me coffee, like we were all just a happy, normal family. Even Chloe was chipper, chatting about the weather and local gossip as if the previous night's confrontation had never happened. I smiled back. I laughed at the right moments. I asked careful, leading questions. They thought I was weakening. But every word they said, every glance exchanged, every careless slip, they were all weapons I was gathering, storing, sharpening. After breakfast, Philip Hartman arrived with his ever-present briefcase. He looked tired, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cold. I wondered if he realized yet just how much trouble he was in. Dad gathered everyone into the dining room again. The same contracts from last night were spread neatly across the polished mahogany table, this time joined by glossy presentation folders stamped with the Aldridge Property Group logo. Philip launched into a rehearsed speech about exciting growth opportunities, temporary liquidity challenges, and family solidarity. His words were slick, practiced, but I caught the tremor in his hands as he flipped through the documents. When he slid a thick packet toward me, I placed my hand lightly atop it, smiling sweetly. I'd like to review everything carefully before I sign anything, I said, just to be thorough. Dad exchanged a glance with Philip, something tense flickering between them. Of course, sweetheart, Dad said after a beat, his voice overly jovial. We want you to feel completely comfortable. Take all the time you need, Philip added, though the tightness around his mouth said otherwise. I gathered the documents carefully, sliding them into a leather folder. Maybe a tour later? I suggested brightly. I'd love to see all these new developments everyone's so excited about. Nathan jumped at the bait. Absolutely. I'll show you around this afternoon. You'll see, it's impressive. I smiled wider. I can't wait. They thought I was coming around, that the beautiful, foolish daughter they remembered had finally seen reason. But as I excused myself and climbed back up to my old bedroom, I locked the door behind me and pulled out my phone. One by one, I photographed every page of the contracts, uploading them to a secure cloud account. I scanned through the legal jargon, feeling bile rise in my throat. The documents were a trap. If I signed my entire inheritance, $8.2 million in liquid assets and real estate, would be transferred directly into Aldridge Property Group. I would receive a minority partnership interest, a meaningless title with no voting power, subject to dilution at the discretion of the board, a board controlled entirely by Dad and Nathan. In other words, they would own everything. I would have nothing. It wasn't just greedy. It was calculated, ruthless, cold. I set the folder aside and opened another one, an old, worn yearbook from high school, where I had hidden a letter from Grandpa Frederick long ago. His familiar scrawl stared back at me, the word simple but heavy with meaning. Trust your instincts, Sophie, especially when it comes to family. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply, letting the weight of everything settle. This wasn't just about protecting my inheritance anymore. It was about protecting the future my grandfather had fought to give me. It was about stopping the rot that had spread through the Aldridge name before it devoured anyone else. And for that, I needed more than just documents. I needed witnesses, evidence, proof. When Nathan knocked on my door an hour later, cheerfully announcing that it was time for our tour, I pasted a bright, eager smile onto my face and walked straight into enemy territory. Nathan was in high spirits as we pulled out of the driveway, chattering away like a proud tour guide. I let him ramble, nodding politely, my eyes fixed on the snowy landscape blurring past. He thought this was a formality, a victory lap before I signed away my future. The first stop was a development called Lakeside Estates, proudly branded with the Aldridge Property Group logo on a weather-beaten sign. According to Nathan, it was supposed to be a premier luxury housing community. The reality was less inspiring. Half-finished houses stood in skeletal rows, their frames exposed to the biting winter air. Piles of unused materials were scattered across muddy lots. There was no construction equipment, no workers, no signs of life at all. Nathan waved his hand dismissively. Just a small hiccup with permits. Nothing unusual. We'll be back on track soon. I smiled, pretending to believe him, but inside, my suspicions hardened into certainty. The next stop was a retail complex, Asbury Crossing. It looked promising from a distance, all sleek glass and steel, until we got closer. The anchor store, a big box retailer, had pulled out. Most of the other storefronts sat empty, plastered with for lease signs that flapped weakly in the wind. Finalizing contracts with new tenants, Nathan said too quickly. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, the skin across his knuckles stretching white. I leaned back in my seat, feigning casual interest. These projects must have cost a fortune, I mused. You must have some really patient investors. There was a beat of silence too long to be innocent. Nathan forced a laugh. Well, in business, there's always a little risk involved. You just have to keep moving forward. I turned my head to look out the window, hiding my expression. Keep moving forward, even if it meant burying everyone else along the way. The final stop was the Lakeshore Towers, a gleaming office complex meant to revitalize the downtown economy, according to Nathan's enthusiastic spiel. The building's frame was complete, but the windows were dark, the parking lot deserted except for a few piles of dirty snow. We didn't even get out of the car. Redesigning the interior layouts, Nathan said lamely, to better suit tenant needs. I nodded, noting every lie, every half-truth, every gaping hole where millions of dollars had disappeared. As we drove back toward the estate, Nathan grew more relaxed, mistaking my silence for acquiescence. He started talking about future projects, expansion plans, even casually mentioning a few private investors who had stepped in to cover shortfalls. The words slid off his tongue easily, too easily. I asked one careful question after another, wrapping my voice in wide-eyed innocence, letting him brag and boast and confess without even realizing it. By the time we pulled into the driveway again, I had enough to confirm what Mrs. Langston had hinted at, and more. The Aldridge Property Group wasn't just failing. It was a rotting carcass dressed up in borrowed silk, held together by loans from increasingly desperate, increasingly dangerous sources. As Nathan bounded inside, calling for Mom to start dinner preparations, I lingered in the car, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled out my phone. I opened the voice recording app, saving the entire drive's conversation into my secure cloud folder. Connecticut was a one-party consent state for recording conversations, and I intended to use every advantage I had. Upstairs in my old bedroom, I typed furiously into a hidden document on my laptop, compiling everything. Unfinished developments, missing tenants, shady investors, Nathan's admissions. Piece by piece, the noose tightened. Tomorrow, Bernard would return with the final papers. They would expect me to sign. They would think I had fallen back into line. But when the sun rose over Asbury, it would not be the start of a new chapter for the Aldridge family. It would be the beginning of their end. That night, as the house finally slipped into uneasy silence, I moved like a ghost through the familiar halls. Every creaky floorboard, every faded family photo on the walls, it all felt like a set piece, a crumbling stage for the final act. I locked my door, shoved a chair under the handle for good measure, and opened my laptop. My hands moved quickly, methodically, fueled by adrenaline and cold determination. First, I uploaded the recordings from the car ride to the secure cloud folder I had created, the same folder now bursting with contracts, emails, photos, and financial documents I had quietly gathered over the past 48 hours. Then I drafted an encrypted email to Kayla Morgan, my old friend who now worked for the Vermont State Financial Crimes Unit. I kept it brief and clinical. Subject: urgent, potential financial fraud, Aldridge Property Group. Evidence, folder attached. Recommend coordination with SEC, FBI, and state authorities. Immediate action necessary. I hit send before I could hesitate. Next, I contacted James Sullivan, my grandfather's former lawyer, the man who had crafted the ironclad trust that was now the only thing standing between me and complete financial ruin. James had been cautious when I first reached out, but once he understood the gravity of the situation, he moved swiftly. Now he confirmed receipt of the evidence and assured me that formal complaints had been filed, complaints timed to align perfectly with the family's stage signing ceremony tomorrow morning. If everything went according to plan, the moment I sat down at that table, the walls would start closing in. But I wasn't finished yet. At 2 a.m., under the cover of darkness, I met Margaret Langston at Pete's Diner one final time. She looked tired, her sharp eyes clouded with worry, but when I laid out the plan, her face hardened with resolve. "My nephew's ready," she said. "He's a private investigator. Been following your family's financial trail for months. Offshore accounts, fake companies, you name it. Is it enough?" I asked, the weight of the night pressing down on me. "It's more than enough," Margaret said grimly. "The only thing missing was someone brave enough to strike the match." I squeezed her hand across the table. "Thank you," I whispered. "You're doing the right thing, Sophie," she said, "no matter how much it hurts." It did hurt more than I cared to admit, but I had long since realized that clinging to a rotting ship only ensured you drowned with it. As I slipped back into the house just before dawn, the first threads of pale sunlight creeping across the floorboards, I felt a strange, hollow calm settle over me. Today would be the end, not just of Aldridge Property Group, but of the illusions that had bound me to this family long after they deserved my loyalty. At 7 a.m., the house was already stirring. I dressed carefully in the same charcoal pencil skirt and cream blouse I had worn to job interviews in Paris, the armor of a woman who knew her worth, who refused to be underestimated again. Downstairs, Meredith arranged pastries on the good china, her movements brisk, almost frantic. Nathan paced near the windows, tapping furiously at his phone. Chloe whispered to Philip in the corner, her face tight with tension. And Dad stood at the head of the table, surveying it all with the cold confidence of a man who believed he had won. He didn't even glance at me as I entered. "Bernard will be here shortly," he said to no one in particular. "Let's keep this professional." Professional, as if they hadn't spent weeks plotting to strip me of everything my grandfather had fought to protect. I folded my hands calmly on the back of a chair and waited. Waited for Bernard to arrive with the contracts. Waited for the knock at the door that would change everything. Waited for the carefully built empire of lies to come crashing down around them. And this time I wouldn't lift a single finger to save it. The clock on the mantel clicked steadily toward 9 a.m. The house felt stretched thin, every breath taut with anticipation. When Bernard Hartman finally arrived, the air shifted. He entered briskly, briefcase in hand, face set in an expression of manufactured calm. But his eyes darted too quickly around the room. He smelled the storm coming, even if he didn't understand its full force yet. "Good morning, everyone," Bernard said, setting his case on the dining table and flipping open the latches with a practiced snap. "Shall we begin?" Dad gestured magnanimously to the chair opposite him. "Sophie, darling, we've kept this as simple as possible for you." I took my seat slowly, smoothing my skirt, my heart a hammering drumbeat under my ribs. Around the table, Meredith smiled tightly. Chloe picked at a croissant. Nathan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed like a man certain of victory. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table, screen down. No one objected. They were too eager. Bernard slid a thick document across the table toward me. The transfer agreement, the final piece of their grand plan. "As we discussed," he said, tapping the packet with one stubby finger, "this document will transfer your assets directly from the trust to Aldridge Property Group in exchange for a minority partnership stake. Very standard, very secure. Would you mind walking me through it? I asked sweetly. For the record. Dad frowned slightly. Sophie, you've seen the documents, for the record, I repeated, my voice steel-wrapped in silk. Bernard hesitated, glancing at Dad. Dad nodded, impatient. And so Bernard began, explaining clause after clause, the rehearsed lies tumbling from his mouth. I listened, nodding occasionally, feigning the wide-eyed naivety they expected, while my phone's recorder captured every damning word. He was halfway through when the doorbell rang. Everyone stiffened. Dad looked irritated. Meredith rose automatically. I'll get it, she said. No need, I said, pushing my chair back smoothly. I've got it. I crossed the foyer, every step measured, deliberate. I opened the door. James Sullivan stood there, calm and solid, flanked by 2 men and 1 woman in dark suits. Behind them, a black SUV idled at the curb, its engine rumbling low, like a distant growl. James, I said, stepping aside. Please come in. The first agent flipped open his badge. Special Agent Rachel Monroe, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant to search these premises and seize all financial documents related to Aldridge Property Group. For a heartbeat, the house was frozen in perfect stillness. Then chaos erupted. Bernard surged to his feet, clutching at his briefcase. Nathan swore, loudly, knocking over his chair. Meredith clutched the back of the dining room chair, her face draining of color. Chloe just stared, open-mouthed, a croissant half lifted to her lips. And Dad turned to me, his face contorting into something ugly and unrecognizable. What have you done? He hissed. I met his gaze steadily, the years of betrayal, manipulation, and conditional love falling away like ash in the wind. I protected what Grandpa Frederick left me, I said softly. And I protected this town from you. An agent moved toward Bernard, confiscating his documents before he could slip anything into his briefcase. Another pulled Nathan aside, beginning to question him. Dad moved toward me, fists clenched at his sides. You think you're some kind of hero. You've destroyed this family. No, I said calmly, stepping just out of reach. You destroyed it the moment you decided I was nothing more than a $sign. Behind him, agents fanned out through the house, disappearing into the study, the basement, the attic. Their radios crackled softly, the sound of a noose tightening. You'll regret this, Dad spat. We have connections. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Neither do you, I said, smiling grimly. Because this time I wasn't alone. I wasn't the frightened, desperate girl who had once begged for their approval. I was the storm they never saw coming, and they were already drowning. The living room had become a battlefield. Agents moved swiftly, collecting files, hard drives, anything that might hold evidence. The faint hum of printers, the crinkle of paper being sealed into evidence bags. It filled the silence left by my family's stunned collapse. Nathan was the first to lose it. You little traitor, he snarled across the room as an FBI agent gently but firmly cuffed his wrists. You think this makes you better than us? You think this makes you righteous? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. His words bounced off me like rain against a steel door. Meredith sat frozen at the dining table, her hands trembling in her lap, her pearl bracelet rattling faintly against the porcelain teacup she still clutched. She looked smaller somehow, deflated. Chloe tried to slip away quietly through the kitchen, but an agent intercepted her, leading her back with a firm hand on her shoulder. She didn't resist. She just sagged, her eyes hollow, her face pale under her carefully applied makeup. But it was Richard Aldridge, my father, who fought the hardest. This is a mistake, he barked at Agent Monroe, his face mottled with rage. You're ruining innocent lives. You're destroying a legitimate business. Do you know who I am? Agent Monroe didn't even flinch. Charles Richard Aldridge, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. The words rolled over him like a tide, inevitable and unstoppable. As they cuffed him, he twisted to look at me one last time, hatred burning in his eyes. "You're no daughter of mine," he spat. Something inside me twinged, the ghost of an old wound aching faintly, but it faded as quickly as it came. "No," I said, quietly. "I stopped being your daughter the moment you decided my love was a bargaining chip." The agents led him away, the front door swinging wide to reveal a line of black SUVs waiting to ferry them to holding. Nathan went next, still cursing under his breath. Meredith followed, silent, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood, like a funeral march. Chloe was last, glancing back over her shoulder once, her eyes meeting mine, but there was no plea for forgiveness there, only resignation. And just like that, they were gone. The house felt cavernous in their absence, echoing and hollow. James Sullivan approached, his face grave. "It's over," he said simply. I nodded, but I didn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the enormity of it washing over me. Everything I had known, every bond one had once trusted, shattered. But strangely, there was no grief. Only a hard, clean clarity. I had lost a family today. But in truth, I had lost them a long time ago. Today, I had simply made it official. Margaret appeared in the doorway then, her coat dusted with snow, her eyes sharp and kind all at once. She walked to me without a word and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, Sophie," she said. "Hard things, but right." I closed my eyes, letting her words settle into the aching spaces inside me. Maybe healing wouldn't come overnight. Maybe the scars would never fully fade. But for the first time in a very, very long time, I was free. The weeks that followed blurred into a haze of depositions, meetings with prosecutors, and endless hours combing through financial records. I worked closely with the authorities, providing every scrap of evidence I had gathered, every hidden account, every forged document, every lie they had built their empire on. The media had a field day. Local papers ran headlines like "Aldridge Dynasty Crumbles Amid Fraud Scandal." News vans camped outside the estate, their satellite dishes gleaming under the pale winter sun. Strangers whispered when I walked into stores. Some looked at me with pity, others with admiration, a few even with quiet gratitude. I didn't care about any of it. I wasn't doing this for attention. I was doing it because it was right. When my grandfather's trust matured on my 30th birthday, the assets transferred seamlessly into my name, thanks to the ironclad protections James Sullivan had built into the documents decades earlier. $8.2 million. I sat alone in a sterile bank conference room the day it became official, staring at the numbers on the screen. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy. I thought about the people who had trusted my family with their savings, their retirements, their futures, only to be betrayed. And I knew exactly what I had to do. Working with James and Margaret, I established a restitution fund, dedicating a significant portion of the trust to repaying every investor, every contractor, every employee who had been left twisting in the wind. It wasn't enough to erase the damage my family had done, but it was a beginning. A promise that someone, at least, had remembered what integrity meant. At the same time, I founded the Vermont Community Renewal Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to finishing the abandoned projects my family had started, but doing it the right way. Sustainable businesses, affordable housing, ethical practices, real change. The irony wasn't lost on me. The name Aldridge had once been synonymous with greed, deceit, and ruin. Now, piece by piece, I would build something better on the ashes of their empire. It wasn't easy. Contractors were wary. Investors were skeptical. Old wounds bled easily in a town that had been betrayed so thoroughly. But slowly, inch by inch, trust began to rebuild. The first completed project, a modest community center on the site where the doomed lakeside estates had once been planned, opened 6 months after the arrests. I stood there at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the winter air sharp against my skin, the gathered crowd small but sincere. Children played on the new playground. Seniors laughed over bingo cards inside. Young couples toured the new, affordable housing units. Life, real life, was blooming again in Asbury. Margaret stood beside me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, a small, proud smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You did good, kid," she said, her voice rough. I swallowed the lump in my throat and simply nodded. For the first time in years, I felt the faint, tentative stirrings of something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And somehow, despite everything they had tried to take from me, I had won. 3 months after the arrests, I boarded a flight back to Paris. I sat by the window, watching the patchwork fields of Vermont recede beneath a shroud of clouds, my hands folded tightly in my lap. A simple carry-on sat in the overhead bin, a far cry from the frantic, overloaded suitcase I'd packed the night Chloe called. This time I wasn't fleeing. I was returning. I wasn't the same woman who had left Paris under a cloud of fear and heartbreak. That Sophie had been wounded, trusting, vulnerable. This Sophie, she was something harder, sharper, stronger. When the plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle, the familiar scent of jet fuel and cold mist wrapped around me like an old friend. I stepped onto the tarmac with steady legs, breathing in the crisp air, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Paris hadn't changed, but I had. The first person to greet me was Marion Dubois, my former mentor at the design house. She waited just outside the arrival's gate, chic as ever in a tailored black coat and ankle boots, her silver hair coiled elegantly at the nape of her neck. For a moment I hesitated. Then she smiled that rare, approving smile that had once felt impossibly out of reach, and opened her arms. "Sophie," she said warmly, "welcome back." I stepped into her embrace, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it didn't feel like a lie. Over café au lait and flaky croissants at a small café off Rue Saint-Honoré, Marion outlined her proposal. She was launching a new venture, a sustainable fashion line focused on ethical production and fair labor practices, a rebellion against the excesses and cruelties of the industry she had spent her life mastering. And she wanted me as her partner, not an assistant, not a junior designer, a partner. "You have integrity," she said simply, stirring her coffee. "It's rarer than talent these days, and you have both." The words hit harder than she knew. After everything, the betrayal, the lies, the abandonment, to be seen not as a burden or a bank account, but as a woman of value. It almost broke me. Almost. Instead, I smiled, my hand steady around my cup. "I'd be honored," I said. And just like that, a new chapter began. The months that followed were a whirlwind of sketches, fabric swatches, late-night fittings, and whispered strategy sessions in dimly lit ateliers. The line, Étoile Nouvelle, began to take shape under our careful, passionate hands. A celebration of resilience, of beauty with purpose, of starting over. Sometimes, late at night, I still woke with a jolt, the echoes of old fears rattling my chest. But those moments passed more quickly now. Because every morning, when I stepped into the sunlit studio on the left bank, when I watched our team laughing over coffee, when I pinned the final stitches into a dress that would be worn not by mannequins, but by real, living women, I remembered who I had become. Not the daughter of a crumbling dynasty, not the pawn they had tried to use, but Sophie Aldridge, designer, builder, survivor, the woman who had turned betrayal into power, grief into action, and ruin into something that could bloom again. And in the end, maybe that was the most beautiful thing I had ever created. A year later, almost to the day, I found myself standing once again on the familiar cracked sidewalk of Asbury. The town had changed, subtly at first glance, but unmistakably to anyone who knew where to look. The abandoned lots were now bustling community spaces. The unfinished shells of buildings had been transformed into affordable apartments, local shops, and daycare centers. Hope lingered in the air, crisp and tangible. The Vermont Community Renewal Foundation, my foundation, had not only survived, it had flourished. The reason for my return was simple: Today, we were dedicating the Aldridge Memorial Community Garden, ironically on land that had once been earmarked for a luxury condo project my family had never finished. Now, rows of tomatoes, sunflowers, and fresh herbs stretched beneath the spring sun, tended by hands that had once felt abandoned by the very name Aldridge. Standing there, watching children run between raised beds and elderly couples tending seedlings, I felt something shift deep inside me, a kind of peace that no courtroom victory could ever offer. Margaret Langston joined me near the entrance, her sharp eyes softer now, a cane in one hand but pride radiating from every inch of her. "You did it, Sophie," she said simply. I smiled, not the brittle, defensive smile I had worn for so long, but something real, something rooted. "I didn't do it alone," I said. She squeezed my hand. "You started it. That's what matters." After the ribbon cutting, after the speeches and the photographs, after the quiet congratulations from townspeople who had once only whispered about the Aldridge scandal, I wandered alone through the winding paths of the garden. The late afternoon sun bathed everything in gold, the new leaves shimmering in the breeze. And that's when I saw her, Chloe, standing near a bed of marigolds, hands in her pockets, looking small and lost in a way that no designer dress or forced smile could conceal. We locked eyes across the rows of flowers. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Finally, she crossed the distance between us, her steps tentative. "I heard you were back," she said, her voice barely carrying over the breeze. "I didn't come to cause trouble," I replied calmly. "I know." She hesitated, looking down at the soil between us. I wanted to see it. What you built." I didn't answer. I let her speak. "You were right," Chloe said after a long silence. "About all of it. About Dad. About Nathan. About Mom." She twisted her hands together. I didn't want to believe it. I thought if we kept going, if we kept smiling, maybe it would all work out somehow. I watched her, this sister I had once loved, once trusted, who had let me believe Dad was dying just to lure me back into their trap. And yet, standing here now, I didn't feel hatred. I just felt tired. "You were part of it too," I said, my voice steady. "I know," she whispered. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children. "I'm trying to be better," Chloe said finally. "I'm working with a prison reform group, helping women find jobs after release. It's not much, but it's a start," I said. She looked up then, and for the first time in years I saw my sister, not the mask she had worn for so long. "I'm sorry, Sophie," she said. "For all of it." I nodded once. "Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe someday." Chloe turned and walked away, her figure shrinking against the setting sun. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the scent of earth and new beginnings, until the last light faded from the sky. And for the first time, truly and deeply, I realized I wasn't standing in the ruins of my past anymore. I was standing in the garden of my future. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in the stark, gray visiting room of the State Women's Correctional Facility. The plastic chairs were bolted to the floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A guard nodded for me to sit, then retreated to his post by the door, far enough away to offer privacy, but close enough to remind us both this was no ordinary reunion. I sat, folding my hands in my lap, my heart steady but heavy. A minute later, Meredith Aldridge entered. My mother. She looked older somehow, smaller inside her faded prison uniform, but her back was still straight, her chin still lifted with that brittle pride that had ruled her home for as long as I could remember. She crossed the room and sat across from me, smoothing the legs of her uniform as if it were a designer skirt. Her hands trembled slightly before she clasped them together on the table. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, it was her who broke the silence. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I wasn't sure either," I replied. She gave a soft, humorless chuckle. "I suppose I don't deserve it." I didn't argue. She looked down at her hands, studying the deep grooves and fading polish on her nails. I think about it a lot, she said, quietly. About how we got here. How I let it happen. There was no defensiveness in her voice. No self-justification. Just a hollow weariness that felt more honest than anything I had ever heard from her. I was so afraid, she continued, her voice low. Afraid of losing everything we had built. Afraid of what people would say if they knew we were failing. Afraid of being ordinary. I said nothing. I let her carry the weight of her own words. You were right, she whispered. About all of it. About Dad. About Nathan. About me. She swallowed hard. Especially about me. For a long time, I just watched her. The woman who had spent my childhood drilling into me the importance of appearances, of control, of silence. The woman who had stood by while Dad twisted love into currency. I never hated you, I said, finally, my voice soft. I hated what you let yourself become. Tears filled her eyes then. Quick, unchecked, utterly human. I lost myself a long time ago, she said. I just didn't realize how much until it was too late. The silence between us wasn't hostile anymore. It was sad, heavy with regret. Your grandfather saw something in you that the rest of us were too blind, or too scared, to see, she said. You were always meant for more than this family. I blinked against the sting behind my eyes. She faltered, reaching across the table, but stopping short, as if afraid to overstep. I'm sorry, Sophie. I'm so sorry. There was nothing more to say. No magic words to erase the years of damage. No apology strong enough to rebuild what had been broken. But still, I know, I said quietly. And somehow that was enough. When the guard returned and touched her shoulder, signaling the end of our time, Meredith rose slowly. She hesitated, then gave me a small, tentative nod. Not regal, not commanding, just a mother. As she turned and walked away, I watched her go without anger, without hatred, without chains. Outside, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the prison yard. I tilted my face to the fading light, breathing it in like a benediction. The past no longer owned me, and neither did their ghosts. 1 year later, I stood on the rooftop terrace of my Paris flat, the evening breeze tugging at the hem of my linen dress. The city stretched out before me in a tapestry of soft gold and slate blue, the Seine a silver ribbon winding its way through the ancient heart of it all. Below, the hum of life rose faintly, laughter spilling from cafes, the distant strum of a guitar on a street corner, the low rumble of a metro train disappearing into the earth. And above, the sky burned with the last light of the setting sun, streaks of orange and pink smeared across a deepening violet canvas. It was beautiful, wild, untamed, a mirror of the life I had carved out for myself. Inside, my phone buzzed with a new message from Kayla Morgan, now a regular presence in my life, his slow smile and steady presence a balm against all the old scars. Landing at 9. Can't wait to see you. I smiled, slipping the phone back into my pocket. Margaret had sent photos earlier that morning. Pictures of the newest community garden project opening in Asbury. Children with muddy hands and wide grins. Elderly couples planting saplings. The town I had once thought broken beyond repair had found a way to heal, and somehow, so had I. Etoile Nouvelle, our fashion line, had debuted its first collection to quiet acclaim. Nothing flashy, nothing empty, just honest craftsmanship, sustainable beauty, and a stubborn, defiant kind of hope stitched into every seam. And me, I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't fighting to prove anything. I was simply living. The hurt hadn't vanished. Some wounds never fully closed. There were still moments when memories rose up sharp and aching. Dad's betrayal, Mom's coldness, Chloe's tearful call in the middle of the night. Echoes of a life that had almost swallowed me whole. But now, those memories no longer ruled me. They were just part of the story, not the whole of it. I turned my face toward the wind, closing my eyes as the last rays of sunlight kissed my skin. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel heavy. I didn't feel trapped. I felt free. Free to choose. Free to hope. Free to build something beautiful from the wreckage. The clock in the distance chimed 9, the deep notes rippling across the rooftops. I laughed softly under my breath, the sound surprising even myself with its ease, its lightness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a plane touched down, carrying a future I hadn't dared to imagine a year ago. A future that, finally, was mine to claim. I stepped back inside, closing the terrace door behind me, the cool night air brushing against my shoulders one last time. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance, another beginning, and this time it would be written entirely on my terms. The past was a story already told, but the sky beyond, the sky was wide open. I was already in my dress when my phone rang. It was Travis. I thought he was calling to say he was on his way, maybe to tell me he couldn't wait to see me at the courthouse, maybe to tell me how much he loved me. Instead, I answered with a smile in my voice and heard silence, just breathing. Then, slowly, carefully, like he was trying not to break something fragile, he said, "Savannah, I can't marry you." I remember the world tilting, like someone had taken the floor out from under me. I had spent that morning brushing powdered sugar off my sleeves, trying not to cry when Mama kept fussing over the seating chart. I had smiled at Aunt Louise, who drove in from Alabama, let my best friend Shelby twist my hair into soft curls, and tried to ignore that quiet, nervous flutter in my chest, that sense that something wasn't quite right. But even that quiet warning couldn't have prepared me for those words. I can't marry you. The phone slipped from my hand and hit the wooden floor with a soft thud, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. The room went silent. Mama looked up from the mirror where she was adjusting her lipstick. My dad, who had come in with a fresh cup of coffee, froze mid-step. For a long second, nobody moved. Then I whispered, almost to myself, "He's not coming." "What do you mean he's not coming?" Mama blinked, then started shaking her head as if she could unhear what I just said. "That's not funny, Savannah. Stop joking." "I'm not joking," I said. He said he changed his mind. Everything after that was a blur. The hush in the room turned into noise, plates clinking in the kitchen, Mama crying out, "What do I even tell people?" Shelby rushing toward me, her arms outstretched. But I didn't want anyone to touch me. I couldn't be consoled. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left a girl-shaped shell in a white dress and borrowed veil. I walked to the window. Outside, the folding chairs were already set. Balloons tied to the porch, railing bobbed gently in the wind. I saw my little cousin playing with flower petals in the front yard. She was wearing the pink dress we bought together just last week. The air smelled like peach pie and springtime, like everything was still normal. But nothing was normal anymore. I turned around slowly and looked at my parents. Mama was already on the phone with someone, probably my aunt, probably trying to figure out how to undo a wedding in under an hour. Daddy just stood there, looking at me the way he looked at broken fences or busted engines, like he was already thinking about how to fix it. But he couldn't fix this. "I can't stay here," I whispered. "Where would you go?" Daddy asked. "I don't know, just not here." Then, like some kind of answer from above, my phone buzzed again. It was Aunt Jolene. I picked up. "I heard," she said, no need for small talk. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. "Pack your bag, darlin'. Come stay with me for a while." I didn't even say goodbye. I hung up and walked out of the room, still wearing the dress. I didn't take off the veil. I didn't grab my shoes. I just walked straight out the front door into the Georgia sun, into a new life I hadn't planned for. I didn't cry until I was on the bus, face pressed against the dusty window, watching my old town fall away behind me. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of everything. The bus to Willow Creek was half empty, but I took the last row anyway. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want anyone to look at me too long and start asking questions. My veil was gone, but I was still wearing the dress, crumpled and smudged from the ride, the lace snagged near my hip. I hadn't had the courage to change. It felt like the only thing holding my body together, like if I took it off, I'd unravel completely. Every bump in the road made my stomach turn. I stared out the window as we passed open fields and broken fences, tin roof houses and clotheslines swaying in the wind. Everything looked so ordinary, so heartbreakingly unaware that my entire life had just collapsed. When I finally stepped off the bus, Aunt Jolene was already waiting. Her hair was piled high on her head like always, and she wore a denim jacket over her church dress, like she couldn't decide if she was coming from Sunday service or a cattle auction. She didn't say anything when she saw me, just nodded, picked up my bag and said, "Let's get you somewhere quiet." I thought she meant her house, but we didn't drive there. We passed it, her little yellow cottage with the porch swing and the wind chimes, then turned down a gravel road that led toward the edge of town. My heart sank a little. I thought maybe she changed her mind. Maybe I wasn't even welcome there. Then she pulled up in front of an old brick building with vines crawling up one side and faded paint on the other. The sign above the door was chipped but still readable, Magnolia Oven. "Wait," I said. "You're leaving me here?" She turned the engine off and looked at me. "Savannah, if I take you into my house right now, you know what the neighbors will say. They'll be knocking on my door before nightfall, wanting to know why the runaway brides camped out in my guest room. But here," she gestured toward the building, "here, nobody will bother you." My hands were shaking when I reached for the door handle. I don't even know how to be alone. Aunt Jolene softened a little. "Honey, you were alone the minute that man decided he didn't love you enough to show up. But being alone ain't always a curse. Sometimes it's where you find yourself again." Inside, it smelled like dust and wood smoke and something else, something warm beneath all the decay. The old bakery had high ceilings and wooden beams that had turned black from years of oven heat. Sunlight filtered through cracked windows, casting golden streaks across flour-covered tables and rusted equipment. "This place hasn't been touched in years," she said, flipping on a light that flickered weakly before steadying. "Used to be 10 people working here. Now it's just ghosts and old stories." She led me to a small back room with a metal-framed bed, a desk, and a shelf of yellowing cookbooks. A folded quilt sat at the foot of the mattress, smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. "I cleaned up best I could," she said, setting my bag down. "You've got electricity, running water, and a lock on the door. It ain't the Ritz, but it's safe. It's yours for as long as you need it." I stood there, taking it all in, and for the first time since the phone call, I felt something besides grief. Not hope exactly, but a flicker, a pause in the pain, a quiet. "I don't know how to thank you," I said. "You don't," she replied, already halfway out the door. "But don't go lying here in the dark feeling sorry for yourself. If you're going to stay here, you're going to do something with your hands. Clean, rearrange, paint, bake, something." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. She was right. I didn't know who I was anymore, but I couldn't figure it out lying still. That night, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still in my wedding dress, and listened to the creak of the walls, the hum of silence, and the sound of my own breath filling the empty space. No one knew where I was. Not Mama, not Travis. Just me and the bones of an old bakery that once fed a whole town. It should have felt lonely, but somehow it felt like the start of something real. The next morning, I woke to light streaming through the dusty windows and the distant sound of a rooster. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I saw the faded beams overhead, the chipped white paint on the walls, and the suitcase by the door. And I remembered. I wasn't a bride anymore. I didn't change out of the dress until noon. I finally peeled it off and hung it in the tiny closet next to the utility aprons that had been left behind. Seeing it there, white and crumpled, surrounded by the smell of yeast and old wood, felt symbolic in a way I wasn't ready to explain. I spent the day sweeping. Dust clung to every surface like memory. I opened the windows and let the wind carry out as much of it as it could. I wiped the old counters, shook out the rugs, and took the cracked dishes down from the shelves just to give them purpose again. I didn't know why I cared, but I did. When the kitchen was clean enough to breathe in, I sat by the giant brick oven in the center of the room and ran my hand along its edge. The bricks were blackened from years of use, but solid, strong. I leaned in, breathed deeply, and caught something faint beneath the dust. A smell like warm dough and caramelizing sugar. A memory I didn't own. Maybe someone else's story lingering in the walls. "If you could talk," I whispered to the oven, "I bet you'd have a hell of a tale." That night, I went to the little general store on the corner to pick up some groceries. The bell jingled above the door as I stepped inside, and instantly I felt all eyes turn. It was a small town. I knew what they saw: an unfamiliar face, a young woman buying single portions and dish soap. And the rumors had already started. Behind the counter was a woman in her 50s with cat-eye glasses and a name tag that read Cheryl. She leaned over the register like it was a secret-keeping box. "You must be Jolene's niece," she said with a smile too wide to be innocent. "Heard you're stayin' at the old bakery. That's unusual." "Guess I'm unusual," I replied, trying to sound lighter than I felt. "Well, that place has got bones," she said. "People still remember the bread from there. I used to sneak a slice before school when Miss Loretta ran the ovens. Best sourdough I ever tasted." That name stuck with me. Loretta. Back at the bakery, I made a simple dinner and sat by the window as the sky darkened. The air was thick with humidity, and somewhere in the woods behind the shop, cicadas were screaming like they had something to prove. I couldn't stop thinking about that smell, about the way the oven seemed to hum when I touched it, about how good it felt to scrub a counter until it shined. Something inside me was tugging, urging me toward movement. What if I tried? The thought arrived quiet, almost ridiculous. I'd never baked anything from scratch in my life, not without a box mix or a YouTube tutorial. But something about this place made me want to learn. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the oven. Or maybe it was because I had nothing left to lose. The next morning, I asked Aunt Jolene about Miss Loretta. She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "I want to learn to bake." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, you're in luck. Loretta's still around. Lives over in Birch Hollow, just 15 minutes down the highway. Don't get your hopes up, though. She's stubborn as a mule and twice as particular. But if anyone can teach you, it's her." And just like that, the first ember of something new began to glow. Aunt Jolene's old pickup, grown the whole way to Birch Hollow. The road curved through woods and farmland until it spilled out near a weathered little cottage with green shutters and sunflowers leaning over the fence. That was where Miss Loretta lived, a woman I hadn't met, but whose name already carried the weight of cinnamon and yeast in my imagination. She answered the door before we knocked. Small and wiry, with silver curls pulled back in a scarf and a pair of hands that looked like they'd wrestled dough for 40 years. Her eyes scanned me like a ledger. Quick, sharp, no nonsense. "So," she said, arms crossed, "you're the runaway bride from Wayland." I flushed. I didn't think it would reach this far. "I'm Savannah," I managed. "I heard you used to bake at Magnolia Oven. I'd like to learn." Miss Loretta didn't move. She looked at me, then at Jolene, then back again. "Why?" I hesitated. I didn't know how to explain that I needed to bake, like I needed to breathe. That after being left at the altar, I wasn't sure what I was anymore. But I knew I couldn't go back to who I'd been. "I just want to try," I said. "That's all." She stared a second longer, then finally stepped aside. "You got shoes that can handle flour?" That was how my apprenticeship began. The first day, she had me sweep. Not the kind of sweeping I did at the bakery. This was more like a ritual. Then we cleaned the workspace, wiped every surface, and set out the ingredients like soldiers preparing for battle. "Baking," Miss Loretta said, "ain't just mixing things together. It's rhythm, patience, feeling. Dough knows if you're lying." I laughed, nervous, unsure, but nodded. She showed me how to bloom the yeast, how warm the water should be, how to mix without bruising. The first batch was a disaster. Too wet. The second was better, but still collapsed in the pan. "Stop fighting it," she said, watching me struggle. "Let it tell you what it needs." "Dough doesn't talk," I muttered. "Oh, but it does." "Not in words. You just have to listen with your hands." I didn't sleep that night. My body ached. My fingers smelled like salt and grain. But I felt something I hadn't felt in months, engaged, present, tethered to the world by something warm and rising. By the end of the week, I could knead without looking down. I knew how to shape the loaves and check their proof by touch alone. And when Miss Loretta finally let me slide one into the oven by myself, I held my breath the entire time. It came out imperfect, edges too brown, crust a little thick, but when she sliced it open and steam rolled out, she nodded once. "Not bad," she said. "Not great either," I replied. She grinned. "If it were perfect already, you wouldn't need me." We kept going. Every morning, I drove out to her cottage and worked until my arms were sore. I took notes, asked questions, messed up a dozen more times, but each failure taught me something. And slowly, almost shyly, I began baking in Magnolia oven too, just a few loaves a day, starting at dawn, dust floating in golden light like flour in the air. The town noticed. Cheryl from the store was my first customer. She bought a sourdough and came back 2 days later asking if I could make cinnamon rolls. A retired schoolteacher asked for honey wheat. I scribbled recipes in a notebook, made mistakes, burned 3 pans, but people kept coming. They didn't just want bread. They wanted something that felt like memory, like home. One evening, after I'd cleaned the last of the trays, I stood in the middle of that old bakery and whispered, "You still with me?" I pressed my palm to the warm brick oven. It was like it exhaled beneath my hand. That night, I wrote a sign by the door in chalk. "Open Saturday's fresh bread, made by hand." I didn't know if anyone would come, but I was finally learning how to rise. The smell of cinnamon and rising dough filled the air that morning. I had just pulled a tray of honey oat loaves from the oven when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I wiped my hands on my apron, expecting Cheryl or one of the regulars. But when I stepped outside and saw the car, my stomach dropped. It was an old silver sedan, scratched door, Georgia plates. I knew that car better than I wanted to admit. Travis stepped out like he was walking into familiar territory. Same slouched shoulders, same hesitant half-smile, but thinner, paler, like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Hey, Savannah," he said, eyes scanning the front of Magnolia oven like he didn't recognize who I'd become. "Travis," I replied, flat as a cutting board. I didn't invite him inside. "I was just passing through," he lied. "Right." He glanced down the road, then back at me. "I've been here before," he admitted quietly, eyes fixed on the gravel. "A month ago, I parked across the street and watched people line up for your bread. I almost came in, but I didn't know what to say." I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. He stood there, hands in his pockets, shifting from one foot to the other like a boy waiting to be scolded. "Can we talk?" he asked. "You're already doing it." He winced but didn't back down. I know I messed up. What I did, it was unforgivable." I leaned against the porch post and crossed my arms. "That's one word for it." "I was scared," he said. "Everything felt too big, too final. I panicked." "You panicked an hour before our wedding," I said, and I felt my voice tremble, but not from pain, from anger held in too long. "I've thought about that day every single one since," he continued, "and I want to fix it, if you'll let me." Something in me almost laughed. Not cruel, just tired. I looked at him, the man I'd once imagined raising kids with, building a porch swing with, growing old beside, and all I felt was distance, like remembering someone from a dream that no longer made sense. "You want to fix it?" I asked softly. "Tell me something, Travis. Did you fall back in love with me? Or did you just expect I'd stay frozen in time until you changed your mind?" He blinked. The question hit harder than he expected. I just miss you, he said. I miss what we had. What we had, I repeated. You mean before you decided I wasn't enough to show up for? His shoulders slumped. I didn't come to fight. And I didn't come to hear apologies that changed nothing. He stood there, hands hanging useless by his sides, like he didn't know what to do with them anymore. I thought maybe we could try again. I see now. I was wrong. You're different. I nodded. I am. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. When he finally turned and walked back to his car, I watched the dust trail follow him down the road. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just breathed long and deep and felt something inside me finally loosen. I wasn't waiting anymore. When the dust finally settled, I realized I hadn't just closed the door on Travis. I had closed it on the woman who once measured her worth by someone else's promises. That version of me, the one who begged for love, for presents, for crumbs, was finally gone, and I didn't miss her. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and cast warm amber light through the bakery windows, I took off my apron and sat at the long wooden table where I shaped the dough. The place was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the smell of cooling bread. I reached for the drawer where I kept important papers and pulled out the business card Mason had given me weeks ago. I hadn't called him yet, not because I didn't want to, but because a part of me had been waiting to see if the past would come knocking first. Now it had, and I had answered with silence. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. This is Mason Carter. Mason, it's Savannah, from Magnolia Oven. A pause. Then, warmly, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I'm ready, I said. Let's talk. Mason showed up 2 days later with a leather folder under one arm and that same calm, grounded presence that had made me curious the first time we met. He walked through the doors of Magnolia Oven like he belonged there, not as a guest, not as a buyer, but as someone who respected the bones of a place and the woman who kept it alive. We sat at my dough table, now doubling as a conference desk, with a pot of tea between us and sunlight spilling across the floor. I've looked into the property records, he said, unfolding the papers. The building's owned by the county. They're willing to sell. 300,000 flat. No liens, no back taxes. Just old brick and big dreams. I let out a low whistle. That's a lot of zeros. Mason nodded. It is, but not impossible. I'll cover the full cost for now, he said gently. 300,000 is a lot, but I'm not investing in walls. I'm investing in you. The ownership's yours, because this place wouldn't exist without your hands, your story. I stared at him. You'd give me 40%? He smiled. Savannah, this place already has a soul. I'm not here to take that. I'm here to help it grow. I looked down at the table where my palms had pressed dough into shape day after day. I thought about the cracked oven, the burn mark on my apron, the notebook where I scribbled every failed recipe and accidental success. None of this had come easy, and yet none of it had ever felt like a burden. You're serious, I said. Completely. I nodded slowly. Then let's do it. The week that followed felt like a storm of paperwork and county inspections. I filled out forms I didn't understand, sat through meetings about health codes and business licenses, stood in line at the bank with shaking hands. But Mason was there, every step, translating legal jargon into plain English, reassuring me when I felt small, reminding me that this wasn't just his investment. It was my story. By Friday afternoon, I held the deed in my hands. Magnolia Oven was mine. Mine in ink and law, mine in sweat and hope. That night, I stood in the middle of the bakery and let it sink in. I ran my fingers across the same counter where Miss Loretta once rolled dough, touched the bricks of the oven like they were part of my own spine. I wasn't just baking anymore. I was building something that could last. The next morning, Mason picked me up early. I want you to see the stores, he said. Come meet the people who'll be selling your bread. The drive to the city was quiet, comfortable. He told me about his first shop, how it had started with a single shelf of local honey and grew into a network of markets that carried everything from heirloom tomatoes to small batch preserves. He wasn't flashy. He didn't name drop. He just believed in honest food and the people who made it. When we pulled into the parking lot of the first store, I felt nerves twist in my stomach. But inside, it wasn't what I expected. No neon lights. No corporate gray walls. Just wood shelves, baskets of fresh produce, and the scent of real food. A girl named Lena behind the counter waved and smiled. "So this is the baker?" she asked Mason. I blushed. "I'm still learning." "We all are," she said. At the second store, an older man in an apron shook my hand and said, "You bring that cinnamon bread you made last week, and I'll clear a whole shelf." At the third, a mother with 2 kids asked if I made dinner rolls. By the time we drove back, I had a notebook full of requests, names, and ideas. My head ached, but in the best way, not from confusion, but from vision. As we reached Willow Creek, Mason slowed the truck and glanced over at me. "You did good today," he said. "Thanks." "I mean it." I smiled. "So do I." That night, I didn't feel like a woman who'd been left in a wedding dress. I felt like an owner, a creator, a woman who had taken what broke her and turned it into something that could feed the world. 6 months later, Magnolia Oven was no longer just a building. It was alive again. 3 ovens fired from dawn to dusk. The air inside constantly smelled of rising dough, sugar, and cinnamon. I had 5 employees now, 2 high school girls who helped with prep and deliveries, a retired postmaster who shaped loaves like it was a sacred ritual, and Miss Loretta, who still came in twice a week to supervise but mostly just drank tea and smiled when she thought no one noticed. We baked close to 100 loaves a day. Sourdough, honey oat, rosemary olive oil challah on Fridays. Sometimes I'd pause while brushing butter on a fresh crust and think, this came from nothing, from heartbreak, from ashes. The town responded. People lined up on Saturday mornings before we even opened. Tourists wandered in after hearing about us from some food blogger I'd never met. Kids left sticky-fingered and smiling. It was chaos. It was beautiful. And it was mine. Mason kept his word. He didn't interfere. But he did show up, sometimes with order forms, sometimes with new packaging ideas, sometimes with just 2 coffees and a warm, "How are you holding up?" He never pushed, never asked more than I was ready to give. But he was there, always just there. And slowly, something softened in me. One night, after we'd finished a massive batch for a citywide food festival, I found him wiping down the front counter. Flour smudged his shirt, and he looked less like a businessman and more like someone who belonged. "Why do you keep showing up?" I asked. He looked at me, surprised by the question, then shrugged. "Because I believe in this place. And in you." The words hit somewhere deep. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. He didn't press. We just stood there, in the hush of the after-hours bakery, while the ovens cooled and the moonlight filtered through flour-dusted windows. A few days later, Miss Loretta came by for her usual afternoon visit. She eyed the new delivery rack and sniffed approvingly at the batch of buttermilk biscuits, cooling by the window. "You've built yourself something real," she said. "I couldn't have done it without you." She waved that off with a snort. I just pointed at the dough. "You were the one kneadin' through all the mess." Then she looked at me, serious. "And that Mason boy, he likes you." "I know." "You like him?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because admitting it meant letting go of something I had used as armor. "Yes," I said quietly. "But it's different this time." She nodded. "It should be. Different's good." That evening, Mason stopped by after closing. He brought over 2 lemonades and news from the city. We'd been featured in a small regional magazine. Nothing huge, but enough to make people curious. Enough to prove what we were doing mattered. As we sat on the front steps of the bakery, sipping quietly, he turned to me. "Can I ask something?" "Go ahead." Are you still scared? I thought about it, about how I used to lie awake, wondering if I'd ever feel like myself again, about the voice in my head that used to whisper, "You're only what he left behind." "No," I said, "not anymore." He nodded slowly. Then, carefully, he reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. Inside, the ovens were silent, the bread cooling. The air smelled like flour, sweat, and something sweeter like peace. Outside, the world kept spinning. But here was mine. Some mornings, I still wake up before the alarm. Not because I have to, my staff can handle the early shift now, but because something in me wants to. There's something sacred about walking into a quiet bakery before the world stirs. The smell of cool stone, the hush of flour settling in the air, the feeling that this day, like a fresh loaf, is still being shaped. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I understand it was just the oven preheating. One Sunday, I found myself back at the closet in the back room, the one where I had hung my wedding dress all those months ago. It was still there, pressed between aprons and flour-dusted jackets. I touched the fabric gently. It no longer made my throat tighten. It was just fabric now, just a symbol of a life I almost had and no longer wanted. I didn't cry. I smiled. That same afternoon, I walked out to the front porch and found Mason reading over delivery invoices. He looked up, squinting into the sun. "You look lighter," he said. "Maybe I am." He stood. "I've got something to show you." We drove 10 minutes outside town to a small patch of land he'd purchased, flat, open, and kissed by wind. "This," he said, "could be the site of our first storefront." Our first. I laughed. "Well, I thought we could build something bigger, a place that holds both our names. A cafe, a bakery, maybe even a teaching kitchen." He glanced over, suddenly unsure. "If you want that." I looked out over the grass, imagining a wooden porch, fresh loaves in the window, the sound of laughter and clinking mugs. A place filled with community, not just commerce. "I want it," I said, "but only if we build it the way we built this, slow, honest, and together." He smiled. "That's the only way I know." Back at Magnolia Oven that evening, I sat with Miss Loretta while she sipped her chamomile tea and watched a new batch of sourdough rise behind the glass. "You've come a long way, Sugar," she said. "I had a good teacher." She chuckled. "You had something better. You had a reason." She was right. I hadn't baked just to forget Travis. I had baked to remember myself. To remember that I could shape something beautiful from chaos, that I could rise again, even when everything inside me had once collapsed. Later that night, after locking up, I sat in the silence and wrote something in my journal. Travis left me in a white dress, thinking he was breaking me, but he only broke the version of me that was waiting for someone else to define her worth. What rose from those ashes wasn't a victim. It was a maker, a woman who feeds others, who leads with her hands, who creates joy from flour and fire. I am not someone's almost wife. I am Savannah Brooks, and I have a damn good oven. Weeks passed, then months, and life, real life, settled in. The kind without grand gestures or dramatic exits. Just days filled with work and sweetness and small decisions made side by side. One evening, I stood at the back doorway, watching the sun dip behind the trees, and felt arms wrap around my waist. "You ever think about that day?" Mason asked softly, "The one where it all fell apart?" "No," he whispered, "the one where it really began." I turned and looked at him, at the man who had walked into my story not to rescue me, but to build with me. And I said what I now knew to be true. Every day, he kissed my temple, and we stood in the doorway while the night rolled in, warm and familiar. Inside, the bakery smelled like tomorrow, and I was finally home. Sometimes, life breaks you open not to destroy you, but to let something new rise from within. Savannah wasn't saved by a man or a business deal or even a bakery. She was saved by her own hands, by the quiet work of healing, by choosing to build instead of collapse. Her story reminds us that being left behind isn't the end. It's a pause, a space. And in that space, if you dare to breathe again, to need again, to believe again, you just might find a version of yourself that's stronger, wiser, and more alive than ever before. The bread of your new life won't be handed to you. You'll have to make it: flour, salt, tears, and fire. But when you taste it, you'll know it was worth every broken piece.